Hey, this is Stefan from Only Comic Books. Been a fan of the Comics Alternative for a while now, and appreciate the stellar quality. Hopefully my Patreon support can contribute to a new trade.
This is the Comics Alternative Interviews, a conversation with Jonthan Case. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Comics Alternative Interviews. I'm Derek.
And I'm Andy, and we're two guys with PhDs talking about comics.
That's right. And on this interview show, we have the pleasure of talking with Jonthan Case. His new graphic novel, The New Deal, was just recently released from Dark Horse. But before we get to that fun conversation, we want to let all of you guys know that this episode of the Comics Alternative Interviews is brought to you by the wonderful folks at Discount Comic Book Service. Go to their website, dcbservice.com, for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. There you'll find all DC, Marvel, Image, and Dark Horse titles at 40% off of the cover price if you pre-order. With all of the other publishers, you'll find that those discounts are 20 to 35% off of the cover price. And every single month, you're going to find some wonderful specials. Sometimes those specials will be at 45% off cover price, sometimes at 50% off, but often the discounts go higher from there.
And if you click on the Bundles tab, you are going to see a lot of great bundles. Two of those that you're going to see, the October Vertigo Bundle number 1, which is 4 new Vertigo titles for 75% off. That's just like buying one comic book, but instead you get 4.
That's ridiculous.
It is ridiculous. It's so ridiculous that you should take that money that you're going to save, and you should go ahead and get bundle number 2 as well, which is 8 new Vertigo titles for 50% off. You just can't beat that.
You can't. And why would you want to? You can't find better deals than Discount Comic Book Service. So please go to their website, dcbservice.com. We do. They'll take care of all of your comics pre-ordering needs, and after you do get your great deals there, send those guys an email and tell them that Andy and I sent you.
Yes, do that.
We have a fun conversation with Jonthan, and he's got a great sense of humor. And I was wondering about that after having read The New Deal, because as you point out fairly early in the interview, that humor infuses The New Deal, and Jonthan does have that sense of humor in the conversation.
He really does, and The New Deal is a really fun book that I hope lots of people will pick up and enjoy. We talked about that, and we talked about some of his other work too that's very different from The New Deal, no less impressive though.
Exactly. Well, let's go ahead and let our listeners hear how the interview turned out.
Let's do.
We're happy to have as our guest on the Comics Alternative, Jonthan Case. His new book from Dark Horse, The New Deal, was just released the first week of October. Jonthan, welcome on the show.
Thanks for having me.
Now, The New Deal, as the title suggests, takes place during the 1930s. And I have to say, that was the attention grabber for me, along with the art. But it's not often that you find a modern narrative set in 1930s America. So what was it about that particular time that drew you to this story?
I love old things. I love old things that involve monsters and mayhem, but I also love old things that are just stories about people. And in comics, I guess in all writing and creative work, they tell you to make the thing that you'd want to read or that you'd want to see. And, I'd done some fantastic stuff. I'd done a book about a sea monster that falls in love. I've done some Batman 66. I just wanted to do a story that would be a little bit off the beaten path. A couple of people with an unorthodox friendship, and I love old movies. But the thing about a lot of the old movies is that if you're following Cary Grant around, his problem is usually like, well, where's my tiger? Or, just it's something really like white collar, first world problems, right? And I was interested in more like the, take it a few years later, like a Billy Wilder flick, like The Apartment. You have people in radically different class scenarios. You still have that kind of banter and kind of a little bit of madcap stuff occasionally, but there's this real human element to it, human problems. And so I wanted to tell a fast-paced little story about these two people who are kind of down on their luck in the middle of the most glamorous place in the world. And that was how I settled on the Waldorf Astoria in the 30s, in the Depression, just a lot going on there, a lot of fun potential conflict.
Jonathan, I'm a big film noir fan, and last night I had the pleasure to go hear Eddie Muller speak about film noir, and he talked a little bit about the challenges of getting around topics like adultery and sex and things because of the production code. And, we have no code in comics and graphic novels, not really. But the New Deal almost seems to adhere to a certain code, making us feel not only like we're in the 30s, but as you said, the style is there, the clothes are there. It's very, very effective for a modern audience, and yet it almost feels like it has that 30s feel to it with the production code in some ways. But yet there's a lot of issues that you're addressing that never would have made it past the code.
Yeah, well, thank you for saying all that. I think the mode that I enjoy working in is to put myself within certain limitations of the era that I'm working, and maybe that's just a personal thing too. I kind of like implication over the explicit, and I think we're going to talk about Green River Killer in a little bit, and it was the same thing with that book. Just stylistically, I felt it was right for the particular project, but I think a simple thing like a white guy and a black girl sharing a cigarette has a lot of meaning for what their relationship is about, and you wouldn't have necessarily seen that in a movie from 1936. So yeah, I mean, this was an opportunity for me to kind of pay homage to the stuff that I love from that time period, and then just take a closer look at some of the things that weren't covered at that time, and that's fun for me.
Now, you just made reference to the two main protagonists here, Frank and Teresa. It occurred to me, though, that our listeners who may not be familiar yet with the New Deal may be a little unclear about, let's say, the gist of the book. Yeah. So how would you encapsulate this to those who are wanting to read it but haven't yet picked it up?
Sure. Yeah, let's cover that now. So the New Deal is set in 1936, largely at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel. So you are in the Great Depression, but you're in the most glamorous place that was ever created up to that point in history. So you have all of this excess seen through the eyes of two people who are just barely making it, young Irish-American bellhop kid and his friend, a black maid who's moonlighting as an actress in Orson Welles' production of Macbeth that actually happened with an all-black cast at that time period. So you have these kind of two characters who would normally be in the background. Like I said, in that Cary Grant movie, you always see like the black maid, she brings in the tea, but you never really hear anything about her. And I wanted to hear her story and kind of get into her head and hopes and dreams. And so it's a little bit of that Downton Abbey reversal of focus. But along with the class and race stuff that kind of bubbles up, it's really just this fast moving, comedic, lighthearted caper sort of a thing. the setting is really to inform the relationships of the characters. It's not like I'm trying to give history lessons here, but I tried to get enough of it right so that it does, like you said, feel like it's very much of the time and place.
Jonathan, I like that the fact that you mentioned what you mentioned about the time and the place, and the title itself. There's probably a large segment of the readership that may not even know what the New Deal was, and actually, you do a really good job of giving us just enough of a feel for what the New Deal involved without getting into a history lesson. So I think that really was handled really, really well. What parallels do you see between, without getting into the details of the New Deal, but what parallels did you see in that era that made you want to write about it in this era?
Well, certainly the Great Recession has parallels to the Great Depression. I mean, I think largely we're insulated from maybe the scope of troubles that people went through in the 30s, but a lot of it's the same. A lot of the class and race stuff is the same, as we're seeing with, violence and the stuff in Ferguson. I mean, it's all still happening, right? We have dreams that started really in the 30s about, and probably earlier, but they really took root. I think civil rights dreams took root in the 30s, and the possibilities of what we could do socially and politically, enabling people that were not in power, with limited resources like the Black community in Harlem to be a part of a major production, that Orson Welles is directing, before he was really Orson Welles, of course. But, there were like these government mandated programs that were inspired from all over the place, but they had government backing through FDR to do plays and to do obviously the stuff that's less glamorous, like the construction of our roads and things. But all of these major endeavors. But I guess to dial it back to the parallels between our times, culturally, I think we're still struggling to realize some of those dreams, and in other ways, we have made some progress, but we've got a ways to go. So those were, I guess, some of the things that I was thinking about as I wrote it. But one of the things I didn't talk about when I described the book is, it's really about this series of robberies that happen in the hotel, and then some of these themes come up as a result of these robberies. Frank and Teresa, the help at the hotel, are naturally the ones that get the heat when this stuff goes down, and they have to sort through that together and rely on each other to get through those pressures and figure out what's really happening. So, the history of it and the parallels to now are just a way of enriching a very short and fast-moving story.
Mm-hmm. Now, Teresa Harris is the African-American maid that you referenced, and her, I don't know if you want to call it friend, let's say associate at the Waldorf Astoria. They become friends later, but at first there's kind of a, some tension there. Frank O'Malley. Now, dealing with the race issue, this is something that I think if you had created Teresa to be white instead of African-American, the story, for the most part, probably would remain intact. But the addition of Teresa as black is an interesting little twist, and I'm wondering where that came from in the genesis of the story.
That's a good question. I think in my first pass at it, she was white, and it really probably came about when I started digging into the history of that time and thinking about what would be interesting to me to write. Reading about the Harlem Renaissance and the Orson Welles production, it seemed like it was an opportunity, for me to follow that interest and to just have more interesting people to draw. You don't want to be always drawing the same types of people. So it's sort of a self-serving thing too. But Teresa Harris, that person with that exact name, actually was an actress in that era. So as I was looking through my reference material, I kind of found her. She was in a movie called Babyface. I think it came out in 1933. And speaking of code, it was banned for years and years because it dealt with Teresa Harris, the black actor, was friends with who is, the name is escaping me. She was in Double Indemnity.
Barbara Stanwyck.
Barbara Stanwyck. She plays this character who's basically sleeping her way to the top of society, and taking control over all these men in this really kind of sordid way, and hence why it was banned. But it, she had a friendship with Teresa Harris in this movie, and it was one of the only times when Teresa wasn't playing the role of a maid. And so it was kind of, sorry, Teresa, I put you in that role again. But in the book, I do get an opportunity to sort of break her out of that a little bit with her aspirations as an actor, and the later more stuff that you'll get into as you read the book. But so that's, I guess, how that happened. It was a number of things, but it's just more fun that way, really. That's what it comes down to. More fun.
Jonthan, there's a lot of really great humor in the New Deal. And again, it reminds me of some of those, some of the quick, snappy dialogue in many of the films from that era. And there's also a lot of physical comedy. Again, I know you were probably influenced by some of those films, but the level of humor is really, it just really works. Was that something that was difficult to research, or did it just kind of flow naturally?
I think it flowed fairly naturally. I'm glad that you found it to be humorous, because that's always the fear, is like, are people going to think that this is funny and light and enjoyable, or is it going to fall flat on its face? So that's great. I think that just comes from my love of, again, the movies, the plays. I was a performing artist, performance art major in college, and so I like working in that mode of quirky character moments. And I think I do spend a good bit of time on the writing. I like to get the dialogue as tight as I can. I like to get it snappy if possible. So I spend quite a bit of time. I would say at least as much time writing as I do drawing these things when I have a book that I'm the cartoonist on, where I'm writing and drawing it. And that's my preference.
Well, it's interesting that you have a background in performance art, because I have to tell you, when I first read The New Deal and you got to the very end, one of my first impressions was this reads like a really good 4-act play, because the book is in 4 chapters, and it just struck me that, with for some of the reasons that you guys were just mentioning, the dialogue, the characterization, and the way that the story is put together in such a compact way. In other words, every action throughout the book seems to have a purpose. It never meanders. It's always focused. It struck me as a very good, or it would make a very good play. And I'm wondering, were you thinking in terms of story on the stage as you wrote this?
Not directly, but I think it just comes through in my background. Yeah, it probably, I can't help it, to a degree. But I also did have a very definitive intention that it would be a shorter novel, and I wouldn't have much fat on it. I wanted it to be brisk, and I wanted to err on that side of things versus having it be, I didn't want you to get bogged down in a history lesson. I didn't want you to get the feeling that I was wasting your time. I wanted it to be quick and breezy. And I think my background as an actor just probably informs how I make visual storytelling decisions, how I set up blocking and all of that. I think it's really pretty important for any artist to have a sense of where characters are in space and what are their motives, and everything that you really think about in acting is the same that you think about in constructing a visual story, because it's doing the same thing. You're presenting a lie to people that you want them to believe.
Jonathan, there's a really nice scene talking about the authenticity and talking about the humor, and I don't think it's a real spoiler, but Frank is in the elevator with another bellhop, and the other bellhop is making a derogatory statement about Teresa, and we see this sound effect of ding, and we see that Frank has just decked this other guy, and the elevator stops. So it's kind of a double ding because he's just gotten dinged, and he's also the ding of the bell. And it kind of reminds us too of a boxing ring, which also has the plays on the ding, sound effect. So that was a really fun scene. Again, one of those things that reminds us of some of those films that we've seen from that period. But again, just a really nice example of the physical humor and the wordplay too that's going on. It was a really nice scene.
Thank you. Well, I'm glad that came through. And honestly, I hadn't even thought of the boxing ding, but that was probably there in my gray matter somewhere. It does work. You're right.
Yeah, it came across.
Good.
Now, one character we see here, Helmer, is, he's someone that we learn almost at the very beginning that Frank owes money to. And so that's an extra added level of tension that we see woven throughout the story. When I first saw that character, I have to tell you, it reminded me of, especially given the time, Ernest Hemingway.
Yeah, you got it.
And so did you have that younger Hemingway in mind?
I did. I had the world traveling, ultra masculine, do what you will, kind of person in mind, and the mustache, all of that. Yeah. I think I had read For Whom the Bell Tolls not too long before I started developing the New Deal. And I was just struck as I was reading that book about, I don't know, just the way that he treated his female characters. I felt like Pilar, I don't know if you probably read that book, but he has one really fantastic older female character, but the love interest is just not really interesting at all. And he's always using these little pet names for her, and it just kind of, it kind of got under my skin. And I was just thinking he's a great archetype for, well, one, he has his purpose, right? And not to diss Hemingway, like he's a wonderful writer, but as a force, I thought it would be interesting to have this kind of masculine force with major blind spots. It just was a good archetype for me, especially given how the book deals with the other characters like Teresa and Nina Booth as these people who are sort of working within social parameters and pushing boundaries and trying to make their own way alongside of these really typically masculine, power-hungry people.
Mm-hmm. Now, we haven't really discussed Nina Booth, but she's another major player in this book. Now she strikes me as someone who could have just walked right off of the set of a Hollywood film of that era. I mean, she has that look, she has that presentation, the way that she conducts herself. And I'm curious if you had, I don't know, any particular actress in mind, if at all, or maybe a composite as you were creating Nina Booth?
Yeah, I think she is a composite of maybe a Katharine Hepburn, and she's the one that comes to mind first. Rita Hayworth, maybe. I looked at a lot of Rita Hayworth, which was difficult, as you can imagine. But no, it was just trying to capture the spirit of somebody who's that large and in charge woman. I guess you shouldn't say large about a woman, but just bigger than life. Takes all the air out of the room when she walks in. All eyes turn to her. That kind of thing. Somebody who is really in control, even when you don't necessarily think that they're in control. She really is.
I think that's one of the things, Jonathan, I really like about this book is because the characters, I mean, we've got a great backdrop. We've got a great era here, the New Deal setting. But it's really the characters that make it go. And they're so interesting. And like you said, I'm glad you've told us a little bit about the background of them. But I think, I mean, me as a reader personally, I'm more interested in the characters than anything else in the book, no matter where it's set or the time period. And the characters really work here, and we care about them. And it's obvious that you have lived their lives in your head. You know, they've been in your head for quite a while, and they come across on the page as very authentic. And I know that doesn't happen accidentally.
Well, thanks. Yeah, I want to write characters that I enjoy spending time with, because you do spend a lot of time with them in a graphic novel. You know, it's a marathon. Yeah, I'm glad that they came to life for you. That's gratifying.
Now, along with this, when it comes to the actual illustrations of characters, I'm curious to know if you vary the way you draw your figures in order to generate a particular effect. And where I'm going with this, I'll tell you, is in looking at the two main characters, Frank and Teresa. It strikes me, and right before the interview, I went back to look through this again just to make sure that I wasn't making this up. It seems to me that Teresa is drawn with a little more fine detail, much more realistic looking than Frank. I mean, Frank is drawn realistic, although there's something about his features, especially the face, that seem a little softer, more rounded, less angled ways that he is depicted. And I thought, does that have something to do with the fact that he is much more of a comedic character, at least overtly so, whereas Teresa is someone who is much more serious? And was that me? Was there something that you were going toward in the way that you drew those two characters that suggests that I may not be off base?
No, yeah, I think you're absolutely right, and I am not afraid of taking a slightly different technical approach towards drawing characters within the same book if it means that the character itself will come through clearly. I wanted Frank to have a sense of whimsy. He's not as smart as Teresa. If the two of them are in the room, he's going to have the lower status. That's one of the things they teach you in acting, is like whoever has the most movement on stage is the one who has the least status. So Teresa is more like, she's more cautious, she's more intellectual, and angularity and the sense of how she moves enhances that, as does the characteristics that you just described about Frank. So yeah, it's in there. Hopefully it's subtle enough that it doesn't take you out of the story as you're reading it. That's always the tension, is how far can you push the cartooning of something before it gets into this discord, right?
Yeah. No, Frank definitely doesn't look like, let's say, Charlie Brown with a bellhop hat on. But he does, and I'm looking at his nose, and I mean that's one of the things that strikes me is it is more of a cartoony, if that makes sense, nose than about all the other characters in the book. But I think that adds to his comedic, at times a little foolish character, but a good foolish. He strikes me as someone who may at some point aspire to be a confidence man, but would fail miserably in that attempt.
Yeah, I think he has a lot of aspirations that he probably would not work out too well for him. One of the things about writing this book was I wanted characters that were relatable, that you would root for, as you say, but that you also aren't necessarily thinking, that's the best reason to do that, or that's what I would do. They kind of get into some trouble, and how they work through that is sort of it could be a little bit not the most law-abiding sort of way that you would go about something if you were, if you're the sort of person that wants to abide by laws. Anyway, that's a really roundabout way. I'm trying not to spoil things. I'm going to totally spoil things, but at any rate, yeah, I wanted it to be, I wanted there to be gray area to these characters and how they're dealing with their problems, but also make them really personable.
Jonthan, speaking a little bit about the technical approach, I think you used Manga Studio software for this book. Is that right?
Yeah. So what I did was I laid the whole book out after the script was done in Manga Studio, and then I did the line work, the inks digitally, and then I printed that out, and I did a watercolor wash on top, and then scanned that back in, laid it under the ink. So it's sort of a hybrid of Manga Studio digital art and traditional techniques.
Did you like? Are you basically like a traditional guy as far as the materials and things, or is there a reason that you used Manga Studio over something like Photoshop?
Well, I'll tell you, Manga Studio blows Photoshop out of the water in every conceivable way. If you're illustrating, there's just, at this point especially, no reason to be using Photoshop anymore, because the language of the interface is so similar that you can jump into Manga Studio very quickly. It does almost everything much better than Photoshop in terms of the handling of the tools and the ease of use for drawing in particular. Photoshop still does a lot that Manga Studio can't, but for illustration purposes, it's just no contest. So yeah, I love to nerd out about tech stuff. I am a tech guy, but I do like traditional art as well. The first couple of books that I did were 100% traditional media. Dear Creature and Green River Killer were both just me with a brush pen and, big pieces of Bristol board. And every project that I've done has had some amount of physical media. I've moved progressively more digital just because it avails a certain ease when you're working with, say, all the reference material that I needed for the New Deal. I could just pop in a model of a 1930s Ford, or I could, get different kinds of pictures, archive photos of the Waldorf Astoria, and piece them together to recreate what it might have looked like in 1936. That was all a little bit faster on the computer, and that allowed me to focus more of my time and energy on getting the drawings solid, rather than having to draw 2 times, for pencils and then again in inks, as you have to do, or at least I have to do when I'm working traditionally. So those are some of the reasons for why I approached the New Deal the way that I did. But every book is different. I tend to take whatever approach makes sense to me for the particular project.
Now, you were mentioning the process and the wash. Now, this is in a monochrome, which looks like, a little lighter teal or grayish teal. What went into the decision to work in monochrome instead of just black and white or full color?
Well, there are certain things that I wanted to capture that black and white would get me to about 75% of the distance. I wanted to create the sense that you're watching something or you're reading something that, again, could have come from that era. And they could actually do beautiful full color comics, even earlier than the 1930s. And they put ours to shame today, really, with Little Nemo and Slumberland and all that stuff. But I wanted it to have the feeling of 1936. And largely when you think of 1936, you think black and white. But you also think of some subtle tonal shifts when you think of those really gorgeous, glamorous photos and film frames of people. there's a gradation in the tone that would have just been harder to pull off with straight black and white. And also, when you were if say you're watching a movie from that time period, occasionally, if it's not a very good print, it'll have a subtle color cast to one reel of the film, and then another one, this one's a little bit bluish and this one's a little bit yellowish. And so that was sort of what I was trying to capture there as well.
Yeah, it definitely feeds into, I guess, the time that you're working in here. Now, if we can just shift to another book of yours that is in black and white, and that is Green River Killer, completely different narrative. This is written by Jeff Jenson, based on the actual Green River Killer tragedy from a few decades ago. Now, it seems that makes sense to represent in black and white. How did you come to this project? Did Jensen approach you? How did you get involved in it?
Dark Horse approached me after they already had a deal going with Jeff. I was the second artist that was attached to the project. They were working with someone else initially, and for whatever reason, they decided to part company. I don't know the specifics, but so I had been in talks with Dark Horse. I had moved to Portland not too long before I got connected with Green River Killer. So I started meeting the editors, and we'd been talking about a project that we might be able to get going. And so Sierra Hahn reached out to me and said that, she'd shown my work to Jeff, and he'd responded really well to it, and would I want to do this serial killer book? And I said, no, thank you. Because all I could see were the big red flashing neon letters of serial killer. This is how you will be seen. You've just done a book about a sea monster that eats people, and now you're going to do something even darker. And so thankfully Sierra came back to me even after I'd turned her down initially and said, no, this is actually what we want. We want you because we believe that you will take a very specific tack with it away from something explicit and into, I guess for lack of a better word, something that would have a sense of compassion towards the people who are involved in this case and the victims and all that. Real people, right? I didn't want to be sensational with it. I didn't want to do your typical serial killer story. And when they talked to me about how it wasn't really so much a serial killer story as it was a story of Jeff's dad, the guy who was keeping this case alive for 20 years long after it become really politically unpopular and long after anybody thought that they would ever solve it. It was this kind of ordinary guy who was part of a team who were just really persistent and were putting in the time to get it figured out, and finally did. And so that was the hook for me, was the family man story. And they let me run with it in that direction. And and I think that's the direction that they had wanted to go from the beginning, and together we sort of found it. We found our way through it, and it wasn't always easy. We had to pull back here and there from, I drew some things that were just god awful, ways to spend your day, and we ended up cutting some of those because, there was this line that we had to figure out together about where we wanted to go and where we didn't. So.
You mean explicit scenes?
Yeah, like Gary Ridgway, the Green River Killer, doing his thing. I think in the book we end up never really showing that, but they're in the first script that I received, they did want to show it, just because they thought, well, maybe that's the way to treat this, is to be honest about it, honest about what was happening. But I think when you're dealing with a drawing of something, it just inherently changes the nature of your subject matter to this more object-oriented kind of thing. That's what a drawing is, right? It's just this it turns what's real into an object. And so when you're dealing with reality, with these real people, I think you have to be really careful about your approach to what you draw and how you draw it. If you're at all worried about that, being distasteful or being not honoring of the people who are involved. So anyway, we figured that out, and yeah, we did end up cutting some of that stuff and just changing it. And I think the book is better as a result.
Jonthan, I think one of the book's greatest strengths is, as you mentioned, the amount of restraint that's used in it could have gone in a lot of different ways, but the amount of restraint that you've put in the book is incredible. I wanted to ask you about what to me is still the most chilling scene, and it's that opening section. And it's absolutely horrifying.
Oh yeah.
But when you look at it, and this isn't too much of a spoiler for anyone who hasn't read the book, the opening contains very little blood, but it is just the most horrifying opening of a book that I can remember in years and years and years. And I wanted to ask you, what decisions did you make in how you were going to portray that scene visually?
Oh, let's see. That one was a tough one to approach, right? Because we had just had these conversations about where I would go and where I wouldn't. And basically what I told them was I'll take it as far as Alfred Hitchcock could have taken things in his heyday. He did I think a rated R thing right before he stopped making movies or passed away. But he did all right with scaring people with limitations. So I think that with that as my guide, that's how I approached that first scene and the subsequent material. That was tough, but I think getting back to the way that the way that I drew the book, it's black and white. So that in and of itself gives you a little bit of distance from how visceral a moment that really is. Maybe hits you in a slightly different way. Because it's left up to your imagination a little bit more to fill in those details, which in a way is probably more effective as somebody responding in horror to something, to let your own mind fill in the scary places.
Now, you mentioned a couple of times when you were drawing Green River Killer, doing what they were asking of you. How much liberty did you have in terms of visually representing that story? Did you have much leeway? Did they more or less explain that you needed to follow a particular, let's say, visual script, so to speak?
Well, they really gave me a lot of freedom where I needed it, and they gave me reference material where I needed it too. I had a lot of pictures of particular places, like the house that Jeff grew up in, and his dad, Tom, who is the lead detective that we're following in this story. All of those places and faces I tried to represent as well as I could, without being too beholden or so beholden to getting the likenesses just right, so that I couldn't put my own self into it, if that makes sense. When you're doing a drawing, if you want it to stay loose and fluid, it really has to become sort of a drawing of you. In a way, it has to have your own visual language. And so they gave me the freedom to do that, and that was really helpful. There were only a few conversations that we had early on about, my dad doesn't really look like that, or my hair isn't that way, or and I think that they gave me a lot of leeway, which I really appreciated, because you can, with these historical works, get really bogged down in details that don't necessarily matter, to the person reading it. They just want to enter into the story, and it's more important for you to sell an emotion than it is to get the ears right on somebody who's emoting.
Jonthan, one of the things I really appreciated that you did so effectively in Green River Killer is to convey the passage of time on the faces of the characters, because this is a story that takes place over a 20-year span. But one of the really creepiest things about the killer, Ridgway, really doesn't have anything to do with how he looks, but how he tries to make the people around him comfortable with his character, whether that's the women he meets or the investigators themselves. And I wanted to ask you, what was it like to visually portray this guy who's clearly a monster, but yet who's very effective in verbally disarming people?
Yeah, I think that we all can connect with the monster pretty easily. That's, I think, what draws people to monster stories, whether it's the Wolf Man or a serial killer or whatever it is. We all somewhere have tapped into our own lack of empathy. We all have limitations around how much we can care about other people. And hopefully we develop that care and we nurture that. But I think as children especially, we start out from this place of really just pure ego, and it's all about me. And if you like me, great, and it's because I've manipulated you into it in some way. It's really, I thought of Gary in that kind of childlike way. He just really he hasn't developed the sort of higher level empathy for other people that hopefully most of us do. But again, yeah, I think that in myself, I have the capacity to not care. And that's, I guess, what you have to tap into. And that's sometimes what can be a day wrecker after you spend a day like being in that headspace and living the interior life of a character like that. Like, I don't get the sense that everybody who draws comics puts themselves through that, but I think a lot of people do, and I think I'm one of them. I have to sort of enter into that a bit in order to make it a success for myself at least, and hopefully for the book as a whole. But yeah, it's not always comfortable.
Probably a lot easier getting into Frank O'Malley's head than it is
yeah,
Gary
Frank
Ridgway.
Pretty easily. Gary Ridgway's a little tougher, yeah.
I want to go back to something that Andy alluded to, and that is the way that you handle time in Green River Killer. Because I see this handled most adeptly with the main character, Tom Jensen. We see him, early in the book, it's kind of a chronological progression where we see him as a young man, a little older, young married, and then getting into the police force. But then after that, we get an adult, mustached Tom. But it's not the same character in that you go back and forth, temporally speaking. Back in the 1980s, we're up in more contemporary, the 2000s, where they have Ridgway in custody, and you go back and forth, and you change Tom, his facial features, the amount of fat on his face, the amount of hair that he has on his head. Mustache seems to be about the same. I'm wondering, was time one of the biggest challenges in representing this historical narrative?
Let's see. I think I solved some problems for myself pretty early on when I decided there were a few features of Tom's face that I would exaggerate and carry through his age, regardless of where we were at in the story. So I had that to lock onto. I had these, two lines just off of either side of his nose. I had sort of his chin. So I was very specific about calling out a few things that would let me do that jumping back and forth in time and have you still be able to realize, oh yeah, it's Tom. So I don't feel like I struggled with that too much. Let me think if there's anything else to say about that. Yeah, looking at the book now, of course, I can see places where I struggled with drawing a face, or maybe I was being too beholden. When you're some of the early pages, it looks more photorealistic, and some of the later pages, I was just letting myself roll because early on you really want to nail the likeness. So as an artist, I can see a progression myself that was probably not intentional, but it happened regardless. And whenever you're drawing a book with 200 pages, you're going to have a little bit of drift in your character models. So I can pick out that stuff, but hopefully, yeah, like you say, there were enough reference points visually that people could look at it and make those jumps through time with us.
Were you able to spend any time with Tom, or was it mainly Jeff?
Let's see. I can't remember. I think I got to meet Jeff before the book was done, but I did not get to meet Tom and his family until after the book was a wrap. So that might have actually been a good thing for me in the sense of what I was talking about before, with not worrying too much about being beholden to what Tom actually looks like. And having the freedom. Because one of the realities of this book was I had to draw it faster than anything else I've drawn in my career. Because of, Jeff was working a job at Entertainment Weekly, and he would get me script when he could get it to me. And sometimes that meant I would have to, I think on the book I averaged, 2 pages of completed artwork a day, pencils and inks. So,
wow.
1 week I did like 21 pages of inks on that book. And, an artist like Chris Somney will just do that and not think anything about it. But for me, it was a big deal. It was moving at a good clip. So, I had to not worry about some of those details. It was like shoot from the hip art is how I thought of that book. But I did get to meet Tom and Charlene and Jeff's brother Mike, and I've since connected with them a couple times, and they're incredibly sweet people. They're everything you see in the book and more. And Charlene gave me cookies when I met them, so that was
That's nice.
And a very very sweet note about how I'd portrayed them in the book, which. I can only imagine that when they're not talking to me, they're like, "Yep, you didn't get the ears right." but that they're very sweet about it, and they seem to appreciate our efforts at depicting them.
And you got cookies out of it.
I got cookies. That's all about the cookies.
Yeah. Now, originally, Green River Killer came out just a tad over 4 years ago, back in September of 2011, and I guess a new edition or new release of the book is coming out in the next month. Is that it?
Yeah, I just got my copies in the mail, so that must mean it's soon.
Yeah. So I'm wondering why the re-release of Green River Killer at about this time. Does this coincide with the release of your new book, The New Deal?
I don't think that was the reason. I think it was just that maybe Dark Horse's rights to print the book had expired, or it was out of print. And in order to, I'm not sure exactly how this went with all the legalese, but essentially the book was out of print and hardcover, and they wanted to retain publishing rights, and so they may have worked with Jeff on this more directly, but they essentially re-released it in soft cover to give it a second life at Dark Horse.
Because, I remember when The New Deal was first solicited in the previews catalog, and in fact, Andy and I were doing a preview show, and we both highlighted the New Deal. And I remember at the time, I had not yet read, and this is early this year, I had not yet read Green River Killer, but Andy had, and he said, this is really good, and I'm looking forward to The New Deal because... Case did such a great job in illustrating Green River Killer. And then I remember that next month there was a solicit for this new edition of Green River Killer, and I was wondering if there was some connection. So it's just basically fortuitous timing?
I think so, yeah. Just one of those things. When Green River Killer first came out, speaking of fortuitous timing or just weird timing, I had just released my first book that I'd been working on for years, and before Green River Killer, which was Dear Creature, and they came out the same week. It was just like the book deals lined up and the publishing schedule lined up in that way, and it was weird. So then, I had again, like now I have multiple books to promote at the same time. You go years working on these things, and then it's like, well, now they're out together, and which way do I turn? It all gets done somehow, but it can be a little crazy.
Well, Jonathan, I had to tell you this story. I think Derek knows it, but a couple of weeks ago we were at Small Press Expo, and I got Durf Backdurf to sign my copy of My Friend Dahmer. And on the front page, he drew a picture of Jeffrey Dahmer speaking my name. And I was so freaked out about that. And I thought, if I ever
tell
get
me that.
Yeah, I didn't?
No.
So, Jonathan, if I ever get you to sign my copy of Green River Killer, you've got to promise not to draw a picture of Gary Ridgway saying my name on the front page.
Okay, yeah, I have no problem not drawing Gary Ridgway doing something creepy again. That would be just fine with me. Well, one of the best things I ever got to do when that book had come out, somebody brought me a copy that had misprinted, like there were 8 blank pages in the middle of it or something, and they brought me that book at a convention, and they said, so my copy didn't turn out right. Will you fill in these blank pages with whatever you want? And so gosh. I got to, one of them was like a double page spread, so I got to do like a centerfold of Tom smoking a cigarette in his like heart, patterned undies or something. It was in a wife beater, and it was really, really funny, adding a little levity to a really
That's great.
dark.
Well, see, Andy, I think this is an opportunity for you to start a collection of serial killer comics where, you're being addressed by the actual killer himself.
Yeah, I thought that's what you were going to ask. Yeah, you wanted me to do the same thing, but
no, that freaked me out so bad. I may not even open the book up again.
You have to give it to your local.
I didn't know why you were twitching that after that first day at the SPX. So now I know.
Yeah, I don't know about that Backdurf guy.
Well, it's interesting that just the other day I was just to make sure that I was okay with the release date of the New Deal, and then I looked up the release date on Amazon of this reissue of the Green River Killer, and Amazon lists My Friend Dahmer as one of the recommended books along with Green River Killer. Have others been linking Green River Killer to My Friend Dahmer or other comics that deal with serial killers? Because there are others.
I don't know. I have people occasionally come up and say, "Oh yeah, I read that, and so I want to read this." Yeah, I think it's one of those things. Like my wife loves watching Dateline. It's like an obsession with her. And she just can't get enough of these horrible stories. And she's a wonderful, loving mother, but she just loves these like awful, murderous stories. So I think it's all what people are buying, what they're ordering off of Amazon. It probably links up that way. Oh yeah, if you enjoyed this book about a horrible person, you'll probably enjoy this other book about a horrible person. But yeah, people have talked to me about reading Torso, and they like that, and
yeah,
they
Torso,
also
that's
like
another one.
or something. Yeah, so but yeah, I don't know. A lot of people also will tell me that they gave Green River Killer to somebody that didn't read comics, and that to me is, in a way, the best compliment that you can give one of my books is if you're willing to bring somebody else into the fold through one of my works. That I do hear that quite a bit with Green River Killer, which is great.
And I'm sure that that's the case because that is a historically based narrative. I would think that you would hear that less for something, let's say, like a New Deal.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I think all of my books, to a degree, operate outside of what you might walk into a comic shop looking for, right? Because the New Deal, again, it doesn't have vampires and ghosts or aliens, and I like all that stuff, but it's just a straight a straight love letter to 1930s films and plays and classic cinema and that kind of thing, and it and that's it, right? And I entered into comics from a place of not being up on all my superhero knowledge. Like, I know who they are, most of them, but I didn't grow up reading that stuff. I grew up reading mostly newspaper comics and So it was only late in the game, after I was done with college, that I sort of started pursuing graphic novels and comics as a storytelling mode of expression. And so I think and I hope that all of my books have the ability to bring in people that don't normally read comics. But you're probably right that it's the historical aspect of Green River Killer that makes it a strong player for people that don't normally read this sort of thing.
What can you tell us about your work with Periscope, being part of that cooperative?
Yeah, no, it's a great group of people. I love them all to death. I hardly see them these days because I've got young kids, and the studio's downtown and I'm not. And when I'm running a 3-year-old to preschool or wherever it is, and it's just harder to get downtown nowadays. I spend a lot more time working from home because my wife also works a couple days a week, and so between all of us, we figure out a way to get these children raised and fed and keep them alive. And before, when I would have kids, or when I would have friends that would have kids and they would come into the studio less and less, I was really judgy. I just thought, oh yeah, geez, if you'd be getting so much more work done if you came to the studio. But now I'm having to eat my words because I'm working from home a lot. But I do love the studio, and it's it's really just a group of freelancers. We've tried at different times doing projects together. Like, I think they did a Kickstarter thing a few years ago for sketchbooks, incorporating different studio members and that sort of thing. But really, it's just a co-working space, and we have some shared assets in terms of computer equipment and certainly the network that comes about when you get 20 people with strong careers in one room together. And they all look out for each other and will share work when it comes in and it's too much to take on at a given moment for one person. It gets doled out, and or we pitch in when somebody's behind on a deadline. It's a really cool thing. I think it's the best. What do we call it? A benevolent dictatorship. There's really one or two people who really steer that ship and make it a sustainable thing. Steve Lieber is an amazing force in that regard. He's always hustling for new tips on, there's a blogger over here, or there's a startup over here that might need some art on a couple projects. He's a consummate networker and has really nurtured a lot of people in developing their own freelance careers. And so, yeah, Steve Lieber plug. But I think it takes a lot to run that place and to keep it moving along, but through the grace and a dedication of people like Steve, it's managed to survive and be a great place to work for a lot of people for a number of years.
Jonthan, what can you tell us about what you're working on now?
Right now, at this very moment, I'm working on a book for DC called American Alien, and it's a Superman book, but it's mostly a Clark Kent book, kind of taking a different approach to that character. And it's written by Max Landis. It has a bunch of great artists attached to it. I think it's 6 or 7 issues, all drawn by different people. Joel Jones, Jock, great artists. So I'm doing 1 issue of that, and then I think I also have a final issue of Batman 66, or like 10 pages or something. I've already finished it, but it's waiting in the wings to be released this month. And that book has been a joy to work on. My friend Jeff, who brought me on board for the first issue and a few other issues, he's great to work with, and we have a similar sensibility about things. So it's a bittersweet parting, but I think they're going to do more with that series. So we'll see where they take it, mini series or crossovers or something like that. But yeah, after the Superman thing, I will probably be focusing in on my next creator-owned project, and I hope to do something for younger readers. Maybe you're 8 to 10, 12, something like that. Kind of I'm calling it a fantasy field guide, something that will engage kids in the world around them, weird bugs and and leaves and things, but also have a narrative to it woven throughout. So that's kind of where I'm headed right now.
Well,
the last. Oh,
I was going to say, I'm curious, is your decision to work on a book for younger readers, is that because you're a relatively new parent? And I say relatively new because you had mentioned for this interview, you said that this would be a good time to do it because you're putting your son down for a nap. And I know from experience that there's not much of a window of opportunity in parentdom where you can lay someone down for a nap.
Right. Yeah, you really are beholden to them in a lot of ways. Yeah, I became a new dad, and even when I was on the road towards that, I was thinking about where am I at in life and how am I wrestling through these ideas of what it is to be a parent, and whatever I'm doing, whatever project I work on, I just try to relate it to what I'm going through personally to keep it a little bit more real. When I did my first book, Dear Creature, it was this kind of silly monster story about a sea mutant that's out of step with his own time and is trying to find love and connection with other people, but he's really he also just wants to consume, and he's really more self-absorbed than he knows or that he's aware of. So that was kind of me coming out of college. Felt really out of step with things, and so as fantastical as a book might get, I want to root it in the real place where I'm at. It's just I don't a book doesn't really come alive for me in the day-to-day working on it unless I have some kind of connection to it that way.
Well, I'm really excited to hear about the project because my full-time job, I'm a public librarian, but also we've started doing a comics alternative segment for young readers. So maybe that's one that we can look at.
Oh, great. Yeah. Well, as it comes together, I'll be sure to keep you in mind and we can chat about it.
Yeah, that would be great.
Yeah, maybe Andy, you and Gwen can do a special episode on the making of this book with Jonthan.
Yeah.
There you go. Yeah, it should be interesting. The making of it is already, I took a trip around the Southwest United States and I did photo documentation with coordinates so that, in certain establishing panels of the book, you'll be able to look through and see, oh, here are the coordinates and, chronologically this makes sense. So you could potentially take a road trip and follow the characters on whatever path they went and kind of see the same things that they're seeing. But in the book, it's of course transformed and a little bit more fantastic, but you would still be able to pick out things as you're traveling down the road. So, yeah, so it should be a fun one to talk about as it develops, I hope.
Cool.
Well, Jonthan, we want to thank you for taking the time to be on the Comics Alternative, telling us about the new book, The New Deal, and the upcoming re-release of Green River Killer. So good luck with those publications, like bam, bam, one right after the other.
Wonderful. Well, thank you guys for taking the time and having me on. I really appreciate it.
Well, Derek, Jonthan is very versatile. He's a very nice guy to talk to, as we evidenced here in our interview. I really enjoyed talking with him and getting his thoughts on both the new book, The New Deal, and Green River Killer.
Yeah, I was also interested to hear about this next longer form project that he had mentioned toward the end of our conversation, and that is the Younger Reader book, and especially given the fact of you and Gwen with this new monthly series.
Yeah, I'm definitely going to be keeping an eye out for that.
Yeah. So we had a great time talking with Jonthan. We want to thank him again for being on the show. And if you want to find great books like The New Deal and the re-release of Green River Killer, then you would do well to go to the website of our sponsor, and that is Discount Comic Book Service. Their website is dcbservice.com. But in fact, if you go to their sister company, their website, instocktrades.com, you can find the actual books that we were talking with Jonthan about in the interview. So, for instance, you can find The New Deal at 42% off the cover price. You will not pay $16.99. You'll only pay $9.85 at in-stock trade. Same thing with Green River Killer. Instead of paying $24.99, 42% off of the cover price, that's $14.49. So in-stock trades and Discount Comic Book Service, those guys will treat you right.
And I tell you, those are two books that you definitely want to get. And at a price like that, how would you not get those?
That's right. You know, you would be at fault for not doing that. I mean, I would blame you. I would point my finger at our listeners and go, shame on you, listeners. Shame on you. Go get those books at such a great discount if you haven't already.
Right.
But you know, we're not into shaming our listeners. We're into,
not too much.
Not too much. But we're there to help. We're there. Right. Remember, we're there for you guys. And we'd like to actually hear from you. And to get in touch with us, you can go to our website, which is comicsalternative.com. And when you do so, you should see a tab in the right-hand side of your browser that says Send Voicemail. If you click on that, then you can send us a voice message from the comfort of your own desktop or mobile device. It's very simple and easy to use thanks to SpeakPipe. Or if you like to send messages the old-fashioned way, pick up the phone and give us a call. Our phone number is 415-3-COMICS. That's 415-326-6427.
And if you would like to be up to date on all the latest news as to what's going on the blog and on the podcast, the best way to do that is to follow us on Twitter. And we are at the number 2 guys with PhDs. And we appreciate all those people who keep retweeting our tweets. Keep it up.
That's right. You can also get in touch with us via email. We're 2guys@comicsalternative.com, or you can contact me directly via email. I'm Derek@comicsalternative.com.
And you can contact me at Wolverton@comicsalternative.com.
That's right. We're also all over the social media sphere, so you can find us on Facebook, on Tumblr, on Instagram, on Google+, and on Pinterest. And if you like to listen and watch media on YouTube, well, we have a YouTube channel, so you can get your fix of the Comics Alternative that way. You can subscribe to the podcast through iTunes. You can stream us on Stitcher. You can also find us on TuneIn. And you can still find every single one of our episodes, as well as our growing list of reviews and comics-related commentary that we publish on the blog. And that's at our website, comicsalternative.com.
That's right. You can't really turn around without running into us.
And why would you want to turn around without running into us? Because
that's right.
Remember, we're there for you, our dear listener.
Yes.
And until next time, dear listener, I'm Derek.
And I'm Andy.
We'll see you later.